My rich cousin refused to sit next to me at Thanksgiving. He didn't know I had bought his company. My cousin refused to sit beside me at Thanksgiving 3 days after I became the legal owner of the company that paid for his penthouse, his silver sports car, and the watch he kept lifting his wrist to display. Preston did not know about the acquisition yet. Almost nobody did. The court order had been entered late Tuesday, the money had cleared Wednesday morning, and the public announcement was scheduled for Monday. Until then, confidentiality agreements protected the transaction while my team prepared to walk into Hartwell Manufacturing without frightening 800 employees or giving nervous customers a reason to leave. I had planned to spend the holiday quietly. I had not planned to reveal anything at my aunt's table. I certainly had not planned to use a struggling company as a prop in a family argument. People's mortgages and health insurance were tied to what happened next, and I took that more seriously than Preston had ever taken anything with Hartwell's name on it. Then Aunt Diane studied the seating cards and decided that Preston should sit beside me. He laughed. It was not a surprised laugh. It was the short, polished sound he used when a waiter described a bottle he considered too inexpensive. He lifted my place card between two fingers, moved it to the far end of the table, and said he needed to sit near people who understood business. My uncle smiled into his wine. My mother pretended to adjust the silverware. 12 relatives watched him relocate me beside the kitchen door as if I were an inconvenient serving dish. Preston had spent 15 years teaching our family to measure success by proximity to him. Sitting near him meant you mattered. Being invited to his ski weekends meant you had been approved. If he asked what you did for a living and stayed focused through the answer, you could expect the family to repeat your accomplishments for months. If his eyes drifted toward his phone, your work became a hobby no matter how many people depended on it. He believed I ran a small consulting office. That description had begun as a convenient simplification when I founded Rowan Bridge Capital, and it survived because Preston never asked a second question. I did consult troubled companies, in the sense that surgeons sometimes consult bleeding patients. We bought distressed debt, negotiated with lenders, acquired businesses that were close to collapse, and rebuilt them before neglect or vanity destroyed whatever value remained. I had started with one failing commercial laundry 12 years earlier. By that Thanksgiving, our portfolio employed more than 6,000 people across logistics, medical packaging, industrial maintenance, and food distribution. Hartwell was our largest acquisition yet. It was also the first company that belonged to someone in my family. I picked up my place card and carried it to the seat Preston had chosen for me. The chair was squeezed between a folding dessert table and my 16-year-old cousin Lily, who whispered that I could trade with her if I wanted. I told her I was comfortable where I was. Across the room, Preston settled between a real estate developer and a retired bank president. He spread one arm over the back of his chair and began describing Hartwell's extraordinary year. I knew exactly what kind of year it had been. The company had missed 2 interest payments. Its largest customer had threatened to cancel a $40 million contract because of delayed orders and defective units. 3 safety incidents had gone unreported. The pension contribution due in September had been postponed without proper notice. Vendors were refusing new shipments unless Hartwell paid cash. On Wednesday, my firm had transferred enough money to meet payroll because the account that was supposed to contain $11 million held less than $800,000. Preston told the table that Hartwell was expanding. Technically, that was true. He had signed a lease on a glass office in Manhattan, although the factories, customers, and useful employees were all in Ohio and Pennsylvania. The office had imported stone floors, a private dining room, and no operational purpose. Its annual cost exceeded the maintenance budget for one of Hartwell's oldest plants. He told the retired bank president that he had been leading a strategic transformation. That was also true, if transformation included replacing experienced plant managers with loyal friends, moving quality control staff under sales, and paying a branding agency to invent a new shade of blue while machines on the assembly line leaked hydraulic fluid. I ate my dinner and listened. My mother leaned toward me once and said I should not take his behavior personally. She always said that after Preston insulted someone, in our family, the person who caused the damage was considered difficult to confront, while the person who felt it was encouraged to become easier to manage. I asked her whether Preston's behavior was supposed to be professional rather than personal. She gave me the tired look she used when she thought I was refusing peace. Then she reminded me that Preston was under pressure because of the company. I knew more about that pressure than she did. I knew that Hartwell's lenders had demanded a sale. I knew the former chief executive had resigned after refusing to certify numbers he believed were false. I knew Preston had spent the previous 2 months telling his parents that the board planned to name him chief executive, even though the board had quietly barred him from the sale process after discovering he had shared confidential information with a competing bidder. Most importantly, I knew that Preston believed the winning buyer was a foreign conglomerate called RB Industrial. The letters stood for Rowan Bridge. Our acquisition team had used a subsidiary because Hartwell's lenders wanted speed and because public knowledge of my family connection would have complicated negotiations. I had disclosed the relationship to the court, the banks, and the independent directors. Preston was not entitled to know the buyer's beneficial owner before closing, especially after violating the confidentiality rules once already. He had seen my initials on documents for 6 weeks and never recognized them. Halfway through dinner, Aunt Diane asked everyone to share something for which they were grateful. The answers moved around the table in the usual order: health, family, new homes, promotions, grandchildren, travel. When it reached Preston, he said he was grateful for the discipline to build a life, rather than wait for one to happen. He looked directly at me. The remark was vague enough to deny and precise enough to wound. That was his favorite kind. Then he announced that he expected to become Hartwell's youngest chief executive before Christmas. My uncle clapped him on the shoulder. Aunt Diane's eyes filled with proud tears. My mother glanced at me, perhaps waiting to see whether I would make the moment uncomfortable. I congratulated him on the expectation. Preston heard only congratulations. After dinner, he found me in the kitchen wrapping leftovers with Lily. He leaned against the counter and asked whether my consulting work had improved. I told him it had been busy. He said Hartwell sometimes hired small vendors for temporary projects and offered to have an assistant send me the supplier portal. The gesture was designed to appear generous in front of Lily. He was not offering work. He was offering a chance to apply for work that someone 6 levels below him could reject. I thanked him and said I already had a project at Hartwell. For the first time that evening, he looked at me carefully. I told him my firm had been reviewing its finances. His expression changed for less than a second. Then he smiled and asked whether the lenders had brought me in to count paperclips. I said the work was more comprehensive than that. He warned me that Hartwell's finances were complex and that people without manufacturing experience often misunderstood temporary cash flow decisions. He spoke lightly, but his shoulders had stiffened. He wanted to know what I had seen without admitting that he cared. I told him the numbers would be discussed Monday. He asked what happened Monday. Before I could answer, Aunt Diane called him for a family photograph. He left the kitchen after telling me not to make Hartwell sound more important to my career than it was. Lily waited until he was gone and asked why I was smiling. I had not realized I was. I told her I was thinking about Monday. The acquisition of Hartwell had begun 7 months earlier with a voicemail from a woman named Marisol Vega. She supervised final assembly at the company's Dayton plant. We had never met. She had found my name in an article about a medical packaging company Rowan Bridge had rescued and called my office after midnight because she did not know who else might listen. Marisol said Hartwell was being hollowed out. The company had been founded 78 years earlier by 2 machinists who built precision valves for farm equipment. It survived recessions, foreign competition, a factory fire, and the death of both founders. By the time Preston joined, Hartwell made components used in heating systems, commercial kitchens, and hospital sterilization equipment. It was not glamorous, but its products entered buildings most people used every day. Marisol had worked there for 26 years. Her father had retired from the same plant. She knew the sound of every major machine on her line, and she knew when management began postponing maintenance that could not safely be postponed. She also knew that employees were being told to reclassify defective units as pending inspection, so they would not appear in the monthly quality report. I sent 2 analysts to investigate public records and speak with former suppliers. Within 3 weeks, we found a company that looked profitable in presentations and dangerously weak everywhere else. Hartwell had borrowed heavily during a period of low interest rates. Some of that money modernized equipment. Too much of it funded acquisitions that provided impressive announcements, but little cash. When costs rose and orders slowed, management hid the decline with aggressive accounting. Preston had not created every problem. That mattered to me. Revenge stories become easy when one villain is responsible for all suffering. But real companies fail through layers of cowardice. A retired chief executive had delayed hard decisions. The board had accepted optimistic forecasts. Lenders had collected fees while ignoring warning signs. Preston arrived late enough to claim innocence and early enough to make everything worse. He joined Hartwell as vice president of market development after his father introduced him to a board member at a golf tournament. His previous experience consisted of 4 years at a luxury hotel group and 18 months running a subscription business that sold imported desk accessories. Hartwell paid him more than plant leaders who had managed thousands of employees through multiple downturns. Within 2 years, he became Executive Vice President of Strategy. His strategy began with visibility. He sponsored conferences, redesigned executive offices, and hired public relations consultants to place interviews about the future of American manufacturing. He loved being photographed in a hard hat, although internal messages showed his assistant reminding him which color visitors were required to wear. He did not understand production. Instead of admitting that, he treated expertise as resistance. When engineers warned that a planned supplier change would increase failure rates, he accused them of protecting old relationships. When accountants challenged revenue booked before products shipped, he called them obstacles to growth. When plant managers requested money for maintenance, he demanded that they prove the machines would fail within the quarter. Then he connected his compensation to adjusted earnings. The adjustments multiplied. Normal repairs became one-time expenses. Customer rebates moved into future periods. Unsold products sent to third-party warehouses counted as completed sales. Hartwell reported growth while cash disappeared. By the time Marisol called me, the lenders had already begun a private review. Rowan Bridge bought a portion of Hartwell's distressed loans at a discount and gained access to the data room. What I saw there was worse than our outside research suggested. I also found Preston's name everywhere. His Manhattan office was charged to business development. His car service was listed under customer transportation, although most destinations were restaurants and private clubs. Hartwell paid a consulting company owned by his college roommate $1.8 million for a market entry report copied largely from public sources. A corporate apartment housed Preston, not visiting clients. The company reimbursed a wine cellar as executive relationship inventory. Those costs were offensive, but they were not what convinced me to buy Hartwell. The employees did. During due diligence, I visited the Dayton plant under the title of lender representative. I watched workers use temporary seals to contain leaks because approved replacement parts had not arrived. I met engineers who had redesigned a valve that could cut energy consumption by 12%, only to have the project frozen because Preston redirected the capital budget toward his Manhattan office. I saw a wall covered with photographs of employees who had worked there longer than 20 years. I spoke with apprentices who wanted to stay but were already interviewing elsewhere. Hartwell still possessed extraordinary knowledge. Its failure was financial and managerial, not fundamental. Buying it would be risky. Saving it would require new capital, painful restructuring, and trust from people who had been lied to for years. My investment committee initially voted against pursuing the deal. The numbers allowed little room for error, and the potential warranty claims were difficult to estimate. I asked for 30 more days. In those 30 days, our operating team secured conditional commitments from 2 major customers, negotiated extended terms with essential suppliers, and developed a plan to consolidate executive offices without closing the core plants. We arranged emergency pension funding. We identified properties Hartwell could sell without damaging operations. Most importantly, we spoke with managers below the executive level and confirmed that the product lines could recover if quality and maintenance regained priority. The committee approved the bid by 1 vote, mine. Preston was right about one thing that Thanksgiving. I had not built my life by waiting for it to happen. I had built it in rooms he never imagined I could enter, doing work he never respected long enough to understand. At 9 Monday morning, Hartwell's employees received an invitation to an all-company broadcast. The message announced that the sale had closed and that the new owner would introduce the transition plan. Executives were instructed to attend from the main auditorium in Dayton. At 9:12, Preston called me. I let it ring. At 9:14, he called again. At 9:16, he sent a message asking whether my firm was involved with RB Industrial. 2 minutes later, he sent another, telling me to call him immediately because family should not learn important news from corporate email. That sentence almost made me admire his nerve. For years, family had been his reason for giving me less information, less respect, and less room at the table. The moment he suspected I held something he needed, family became a claim on access. I arrived at Hartwell through the employee entrance at 10:30. The lobby still displayed a 12-foot banner featuring Preston beside the words, "Leadership for the Next Generation." Our transition director paused beneath it and asked whether we should remove it before the broadcast. I told her to leave it. Not for humiliation. We had more urgent priorities, and workers deserved to see that the new management was not arriving with a crew devoted to changing signs while payroll remained uncertain. Marisol met me near the auditorium. She wore her blue supervisor's jacket and looked as if she had not slept. She asked whether the rumors about missed payroll were true. I told her the old company would have missed it, but the new company had funded the account. Her eyes closed for a moment. Then she asked whether the plants were shutting down. I told her not if we could make the turnaround work. I also told her I would not promise there would be no changes. False reassurance had done enough damage. We planned to protect the viable operations, invest in safety, and reduce overhead that did not support customers or production. She nodded. Honesty frightened her less than another polished promise. The executive team entered through a side door just before 11. Preston came last. He wore a dark suit, a pale tie, and the watch from Thanksgiving. He saw me beside the stage and stopped so abruptly that the chief financial officer nearly walked into him. He crossed the room without greeting anyone. He asked what I was doing there. I said I was preparing to address the company. He told me the broadcast was restricted to authorized personnel. Our general counsel stepped between us and introduced me as the managing partner of Rowan Bridge Capital and chair of Hartwell's new board. Preston looked at her, then at me, then toward the executives who had suddenly become fascinated by their folders. He said there had been a mistake. I agreed, although not about the acquisition. The broadcast began before he recovered. Employees watched from break rooms, offices, conference spaces, and factory floors. I stood beneath Hartwell's old brass logo and explained that Rowan Bridge had purchased the company through RB Industrial. I described the emergency capital we had provided, the customer commitments we had secured, and the principles of the turnaround. Safety reports would no longer pass through sales. Quality staff would regain independent authority. Overdue maintenance would begin that week. The Manhattan office would close. Executive travel and discretionary spending would be suspended pending review. Hourly wages, health coverage, and current production schedules would continue. I did not mention Preston until the end. I announced that the former board had been dissolved under the transaction and that an interim leadership team would assume control immediately. Several executives would remain during the review. Others had been placed on paid administrative leave because their responsibilities overlapped with matters under investigation. Preston was one of them. He stood in the front row while hundreds of employees learned that his authority had disappeared. There was no dramatic shouting. His training and appearances was stronger than his anger. He kept his face still until the cameras switched off. Then he followed me into a conference room and closed the door hard enough to shake the glass. He demanded to know how long I had been planning to embarrass him. I told him the acquisition had not been planned around him. That answer offended him more than any accusation could have. Preston could imagine being targeted. He could not imagine being incidental. He said Hartwell was his company. I placed the closing binder on the table and told him it had never been his company. Before the sale, it belonged to shareholders and creditors. After the sale, it belonged to RB Industrial. His title had made him an employee with authority, not an owner with immunity. He reminded me that he had spent 6 years building the brand. I asked whether he meant the Hartwell brand or his own. That was the most direct thing I said to him. Everything else came from documents. Our general counsel gave him a leave notice, instructions to preserve records, and a list of devices he was required to surrender. His company phone, laptop, security badge, and purchasing card went into separate evidence bags. He objected to the word evidence. Counsel explained that it was standard preservation procedure. He asked whether I intended to fire him. I told him the review would determine that. He laughed the way he had at Thanksgiving, but there was no audience left to reward it. He said I was playing executive because I had found lenders willing to finance a vanity purchase. Then he predicted that I would destroy Hartwell within a year. I told him that if I failed, the consequences would belong to me. That was the difference between ownership and performance. Security escorted him from the building at 12:23. At 12:40, Aunt Diane called. She did not ask whether the company was safe or whether employees would be paid. She asked how I could humiliate Preston in public after everything he had done for me. I asked what he had done for me. She mentioned the supplier portal. For a moment, I thought she was joking. Then I remembered that Preston had probably described his Thanksgiving offer as an attempt to rescue my career. I told her I would discuss family matters outside working hours, but Hartwell's investigation would remain confidential. She said there should not be an investigation because Preston was family. I ended the call. The first week after an acquisition usually reveals which problems were hidden and which were simply ignored. At Hartwell, both categories expanded by the hour. The physical problems were immediate. A compressor at the Dayton plant had operated beyond its required inspection date. Fire suppression equipment in one Pennsylvania facility had not been properly tested. Purchase orders for replacement guards had been canceled, while the accounting system showed them as delivered. We stopped 2 production lines for emergency maintenance, knowing the delay could cost us a customer, but also knowing that asking employees to work around unsafe machines would make every promise meaningless. The financial review moved more slowly. Preston's expenses were only the visible layer. His authority had allowed him to approve vendors, influence forecasts, and direct the classification of costs. Our forensic accountants recovered deleted messages showing that he knew Hartwell would violate a lending covenant months before it was disclosed. He instructed finance staff to find flexibility in shipment dates. He pressured a regional sales leader to record a bulk order even after the customer made acceptance conditional on testing that had not occurred. When the chief accounting officer objected, Preston removed her from forecasting meetings. She resigned 6 weeks later. I called her personally. She still had copies of notes made during those meetings, along with an email she had sent to Hartwell's audit committee. The committee's outside counsel acknowledged receipt, but never interviewed her. One of its members was the same board member who had sponsored Preston's appointment. That discovery transformed the review from an employment matter into something larger. It also explained why Preston had been so nervous in my aunt's kitchen. He did not know I owned Hartwell then, but he knew an outside financial team might find the trail he had spent months obscuring. On Thursday, our technology staff detected an attempt to access Hartwell's cloud storage using credentials assigned to Preston's executive assistant. The login came from the wireless network in his penthouse building. It targeted folders containing vendor contracts, audit correspondence, and board materials. We disabled the credentials and preserved the logs. Preston called an hour later and claimed his assistant needed access to prepare transition notes. The assistant had already told us she was at home and had not tried to log in. When counsel explained that unauthorized access could violate his preservation notice, he blamed a synchronized personal tablet. The tablet was not among the devices he had surrendered. Our employment agreement allowed Hartwell to demand return of company information stored on any device. Preston refused. His lawyer sent a letter accusing us of using the acquisition to pursue a personal family vendetta. That phrase appeared again 2 days later in an email my uncle sent to my mother, and again in a message from Aunt Diane to several relatives. By Sunday, the family version of events had solidified. I had secretly bought Hartwell because I envied Preston. I had waited until Thanksgiving to trap him into boasting. I had then punished him for moving my seat. The story was ridiculous, but it was emotionally convenient. If my success existed only as revenge, nobody had to reconsider why they had ignored it. If Preston's problems began with my resentment, nobody had to examine his decisions. My mother asked me to meet her for coffee. She arrived carrying printed messages from relatives as if they were evidence in a trial. She said she did not understand why I had kept the acquisition secret. I reminded her that the transaction was confidential. She asked why I had never told the family the true size of Rowan Bridge. I told her I had tried. Years earlier, when we bought our first logistics company, I explained the deal at Christmas. Preston interrupted to say private equity firms mostly moved debt around and destroyed jobs. My uncle asked whether I had considered a stable corporate career. My mother later advised me not to compete with Preston because he was sensitive about being the successful grandchild. After that, I stopped offering numbers to people who turned every accomplishment into a threat. My mother said she wished I had trusted her. I said trust was not the same as providing information that someone had repeatedly shown no interest in holding. She looked down at the printed messages. For most of my childhood, my mother had avoided conflict because she grew up dependent on her older sister's approval. Diane chose restaurants, vacation dates, holiday hosts, and the version of every family story that survived. My mother called this closeness. I experienced it as a system in which peace required the same people to shrink every time. She asked whether Preston had done something illegal. I told her the investigation was ongoing and that I could not share details. She wanted me to reassure her that he would be all right. I could not. I said I would treat him according to the same evidence and policies that applied to anyone else. No worse because he had insulted me, no better because he was family. My mother said that sounded cold. I told her it was the fairest promise I could make. The following morning, Hartwell received a resignation letter from Preston. He demanded payment of his annual bonus, reimbursement for unused executive benefits, and 12 months of severance. The letter asserted that the change in ownership constituted constructive termination and released him from cooperation obligations. Our lawyers disagreed. More importantly, resigning did not erase the investigation. 2 days later, a major customer forwarded us a proposal from a new consulting firm called PGM Strategy. The initials belonged to Preston Grant Mercer. The proposal promised to help Hartwell customers transfer their business to more stable manufacturing partners before the new owner disrupted production. Preston had formed the company 6 weeks before the sale closed. He had also downloaded Hartwell's customer contact list the evening before surrendering his laptop. His employment agreement prohibited solicitation and protected confidential information. Enforcing restrictive covenants can be complicated, but theft of customer data is simpler. We filed for an injunction limited to the information and contacts he had taken. The judge ordered him to preserve his devices and stop using Hartwell's confidential records until a hearing. Preston responded by going public. He posted a long statement describing himself as a whistleblower, removed after objecting to plant closures. He said the new owner planned to dismantle an American manufacturer and sell its assets. He did not name me as his cousin, but family members shared the post with comments about betrayal. For 6 hours, the statement spread faster than our correction. Employees became frightened. Suppliers called for reassurance. A local reporter arrived outside the Dayton plant. Someone taped a copy of Preston's post to the cafeteria door. The easiest response would have been to publish the expense records and let public humiliation solve the narrative problem. Our communications advisors recommended releasing enough detail to destroy his credibility. I refused. Hartwell was investigating financial reporting that could affect lenders, auditors, customers, and former directors. Using incomplete evidence as a public weapon might satisfy me for an afternoon and damage the company for years. We issued a short statement confirming that no core plant closures were planned, that safety investment had already begun, and that the company would address employment allegations through proper legal channels. Then I went to the factory floor. I held meetings on every shift. I showed employees the capital budget, including the money assigned to machines, ventilation, quality systems, and overdue repairs. I explained which overhead expenses would end and which production roles we were hiring. I admitted that the turnaround could still fail if customers left or defects continued. I answered questions until there were none left. Credibility did not return in one speech. It returned in small proofs. The pension contribution cleared. The compressor passed inspection. Replacement guards arrived and were installed. Traveling executives moved out of corporate apartments while the company reopened its apprenticeship program. The Manhattan lease was marketed for sublet. Marisol sent me a photograph of a maintenance crew replacing a damaged line component that workers had reported 9 months earlier. Beneath it, she wrote that this was the first announcement employees believed because they could touch it. Meanwhile, the forensic review reached the consulting company owned by Preston's college roommate. The $1.8 million market entry project had produced 4 invoices. Each described research in a different region. Bank records obtained through litigation showed that the consulting company transferred $420,000 to PGM Holdings, an entity formed by Preston 2 years earlier. PGM Holdings paid the deposit on his penthouse and several months of personal credit card bills. The roommate initially claimed the transfers repaid a private loan. He could not produce a loan agreement, payment schedule, or evidence that Preston had advanced him money. Then, investigators compared the consulting reports with material created by Hartwell employees. Entire sections had been copied from internal presentations. Preston had approved payment to an outside firm for work his own staff had already completed, then received part of the money through his holding company. That was not a questionable expense. It was a kickback. Counsel notified Hartwell's insurers, lenders, and law enforcement. We amended our civil claim. The new filing became public, and the family story began to fracture. Aunt Diane called my mother instead of me. She said the transfer was a misunderstanding, and that wealthy people moved money among companies all the time. My uncle claimed Preston's roommate had probably labeled the payment incorrectly. 2 relatives quietly deleted the posts they had shared. Preston's lawyer proposed a family meeting. Our counsel rejected it. The legal issues would be handled through lawyers. If Preston wanted a personal conversation, he could request one without making it a condition of cooperation. He requested one. We met in a conference room at a neutral law office. 2 attorneys remained outside with the door partially open. Preston looked different without the architecture of status around him. No executive assistant, no driver, no banner, no carefully selected seat. His watch was gone. I later learned he had sold it to cover legal fees. He asked whether I was enjoying what I had done. I told him I was not enjoying any part of it. He did not believe me. People who use power for pleasure assume everyone else is waiting for the same opportunity. He said I had always hated him. I said I had hated the way he treated people, which was not the same thing. He reminded me that our grandmother had compared us from childhood. She praised my grades, then told him he was more charming. She praised his friends, then asked why I was not more social. She turned achievement into a rope and taught us to pull from opposite ends. He was right about that. Our rivalry had been cultivated before either of us understood it. But childhood explained the first wound, not the adult choices that followed. I asked whether our grandmother had told him to take money from a vendor. His face hardened. He claimed the payment represented his share of a future partnership. He said Hartwell had underpaid him relative to the value he created, and that executives routinely received opportunities unavailable to ordinary employees. I asked why he had hidden it. He said I would not understand the expectations placed on him. That was the center of Preston's reality. Every advantage became pressure. Every rule became an insult to someone of his potential. Every consequence proved that others failed to appreciate the burden of being him. He said the family needed him to succeed. I told him the family needed him to appear successful. Those were different needs, and neither entitled him to steal. He stared through the glass wall toward the attorneys outside. Then he asked whether I would drop the civil case if he repaid the $420,000. I explained that the money belonged to Hartwell, not to me personally, and the matter was no longer mine to erase. The board's independent committee controlled the company's claims. Law enforcement controlled its own investigation. I had deliberately removed myself from votes involving him because of our relationship. He called that cowardice. I called it governance. Before leaving, Preston said I had bought his company to prove I was better than he was. I told him I bought Hartwell because it was worth saving. He had never considered that answer because he had never seen the company as something separate from his identity. The injunction hearing took place in January. Preston's devices were supposed to have been preserved, but a forensic examiner found that his personal tablet had been reset the evening after the court issued its order. Cloud backups showed deletions from folders containing customer lists and messages with his college roommate. His lawyer argued that an automatic update caused the reset. The manufacturer's records showed a manual command. The judge expanded the preservation order, appointed an independent examiner, and required Preston to pay part of Hartwell's forensic costs. She also prohibited PGM Strategy from contacting customers whose information came from Hartwell. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked whether I intended to destroy my cousin. I said the case was about company information and compliance with a court order. They wanted anger because anger fit the headline. Discipline rarely does. The criminal process moved quietly for several months. Hartwell cooperated, produced records, and continued operating. Rowan Bridge invested $23 million during the first 100 days. We hired a chief executive named Simone Grant, a former aerospace operations leader who had no family connection to me and no interest in executive theater. Simone spent her first week on factory floors. She moved the strategy team from Manhattan to Dayton. She tied bonuses to cash, safety, quality, and customer retention rather than adjusted earnings alone. She invited the former chief accounting officer to return as an advisor while the audit committee was rebuilt. She gave engineers permission to restart the energy-efficient valve project. Not every decision was popular. We eliminated 41 corporate positions, including duplicate vice presidents and personal support roles created during Preston's expansion. We sold an aircraft share, ended club memberships, and consolidated 2 warehouses. We offered severance and placement support, but I did not pretend losing a job felt humane simply because a spreadsheet justified it. At the same time, we added 63 production and technical roles. Nobody on the factory floor celebrated the corporate cuts. They had watched leadership spend freely while asking them to do more with less, and relief existed beside anger that repair had taken so long. By spring, on-time delivery rose from 68% to 89%. Warranty claims began falling. The threatened $40 million customer contract was renewed for 3 years after Hartwell passed an independent quality audit. Marisol led the employee team that redesigned defect reporting. At the renewal ceremony, she refused to stand in the front for photographs unless the inspectors and line technicians stood with her. I thought of Preston adjusting his hard hat beneath a banner and understood that Hartwell had changed more than its balance sheet. My family changed more slowly. Easter was the first holiday Aunt Diane did not host. She said she could not sit at a table with people who had abandoned her son. My mother invited everyone to her house instead. Several relatives declined. The gathering was smaller, quieter, and easier to breathe in. My mother placed the seating cards. She put me beside her. The gesture would have seemed trivial to anyone outside our family. To me, it was an apology delivered in the language of the original wound. During dinner, she admitted that she had taught me to tolerate disrespect because confronting her sister frightened her. She said she had mistaken my ability to endure discomfort for a lack of pain. I did not forgive decades in one conversation. I also did not punish honesty because it arrived late. We began from there. In June, federal prosecutors charged Preston and his college roommate with wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction related to the consulting payments and deleted records. A former Hartwell director entered a separate agreement to cooperate regarding the misleading financial reports. The charges did not mean guilt had been proven, and I reminded employees not to speculate publicly. Privately, I felt grief more than victory. Preston had been cruel to me. He had demeaned work he did not understand and taken pleasure in assigning value to everyone around him. None of that made it satisfying to watch his life collapse under the weight of decisions he could have stopped making at any time. Aunt Diane sent me a letter after the indictment. It began with memories of Preston as a child and ended by asking me to tell prosecutors that the family had resolved the financial dispute. She still imagined the company's money as mine and my authority as personal permission. She did not understand or would not accept that buying Hartwell had increased my obligations rather than freeing me from them. I answered once. I wrote that I could not interfere with a criminal case, misrepresent facts, or use company assets to protect a relative. I said I hoped Preston accepted responsibility and found a way to rebuild his life after the legal process ended. I also said I would not discuss the matter further. She called the letter heartless. Lily called it the first boundary anyone in the family had ever kept. Preston eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count related to destruction of records. His roommate cooperated and returned part of the money. The court ordered restitution to Hartwell. Preston received a prison sentence shorter than prosecutors requested, but longer than his family expected, followed by supervised release. At sentencing, he spoke about pressure, pride, and the illusion that he could correct each dishonest decision with a future success. He apologized to Hartwell's employees and investors. He did not mention me until the end. Then he said the person he had treated as least important had been the only one capable of seeing the company clearly. It was the closest he came to admitting what happened. I did not need the judge, reporters, or our family to turn that sentence into a triumph. The truth was less dramatic. I had seen Hartwell clearly because I looked at the people and systems beneath its executive image. Preston had failed to see it because he looked for mirrors. 1 year after the acquisition, Hartwell held an employee open house at the Dayton plant. Families toured the assembly lines. Apprentices demonstrated new equipment. The energy-efficient valve moved into full production after passing certification. A restored brass sign from the original 1940s workshop hung in the lobby where Preston's leadership banner had once been. Simone asked me to speak. I kept it brief. I thanked employees for staying through uncertainty, suppliers for extending trust, and customers for giving the company time to prove its recovery. I reported that Hartwell had returned to positive operating cash flow and restored all deferred pension contributions. I also announced an employee profit-sharing plan that would begin the following quarter. The applause belonged to that announcement, not to me, which was exactly right. Afterward, Marisol introduced me to her father. He was 82 and wore an old Hartwell cap with grease permanently darkening the brim. He shook my hand and said he had expected people like me to buy the machines, fire the workers, and sell the land. I told him people like me sometimes did. He appreciated the honest answer. Then he asked why I had chosen differently. I said a company was not only the legal entity purchased at closing, it was accumulated skill, promises to customers, obligations to workers, and the consequences of decisions made by people whose names might never appear on a building. If those things still had value, the work was to repair the structure around them. He looked toward the line where his daughter stood with her team and said Hartwell finally had an owner who understood ownership. That meant more to me than any family seat ever had. The next Thanksgiving took place at my mother's house. Aunt Diane did not attend. Lily came early to help cook. My uncle arrived alone and spent most of the afternoon washing dishes because he did not know what else to say. The retired bank president was not there, nor was anyone selected to improve the table's status. My mother left the seating cards blank. People sat where conversation carried them. There was an empty chair near the window. Nobody said Preston's name, but his absence occupied space. Consequences do not erase love, and love does not erase consequences. Our family was learning to hold both truths without demanding that one cancel the other. Before dinner, Lily asked me about her college applications. She wanted to study mechanical engineering, but worried that everyone expected her to choose something more glamorous. I told her glamour was often a tax people paid for needing strangers to recognize value immediately. She asked whether she could apply for a summer internship at Hartwell. I said yes, but she would use the standard application and I would not participate in the selection. She smiled and said she had expected that. When dinner was served, I ended up beside the kitchen door again. This time, I chose the seat because it was near Lily, and because my mother's house was warm enough that the draft from the hallway felt good. Nobody mistook the location for rank. Nobody moved my card. Nobody needed to. My mother raised her glass and said she was grateful that our family had stopped confusing peace with silence. I looked around the table at the people who remained. Some relationships had strengthened. Others had cracked when they could no longer depend on my compliance. Hartwell was recovering, but not because I had revealed myself in a conference room or removed Preston from a title he had abused. It was recovering because hundreds of people did patient work after the dramatic moment ended. That was the part revenge stories rarely showed. Buying the company had taken money, timing, and nerve. Owning it required restraint. I could not treat Hartwell as a weapon against Preston without becoming another executive who placed ego above the institution. I could not rescue my family by protecting them from facts. I could not demand that my mother change while rewarding her every attempt to avoid discomfort. The real reversal was not that Preston had refused to sit beside a wealthy woman without knowing it. It was that wealth had never been the fact that made me worthy of a seat. I had been worthy when I ran the first failing laundry from a borrowed desk. I had been worthy when my investment committee rejected my ideas, when relatives called my work consulting because they could not be bothered to learn its name, and when I sat beside the kitchen door without a title anyone respected. Owning Hartwell did not create that worth. It only removed the excuse my family had used for refusing to see it. Preston had spent years believing the best seat proved he was the most important person in the room. By the time he learned I had bought his company, I had already learned something he never had. The person who owns the table does not need to decide where everyone else is allowed to sit.